Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the RAF Museum's Research Lecture Series. I'm the RAF Museum's historian, Dr. Harry Rafal, and first, can I welcome all of you here joining us in person at Wolverhampton University, but also to everyone joining us online from around the world. A global audience for Paul Stoddard tonight, which is a delight, because our speaker, Paul, is an operational analyst for the RAF, a fellow in the Royal Aeronautical Society, and he's a member of the Society's Air Power and Aviation Heritage Group committees. He's going to speak on British combat procurement, 1945 to 55. I'd like to say at the start, he's a thoroughly good man, a dedicated servant to the history of air power, and his earlier career in the RAF seems to have coincided with operational aircraft being removed from service. So perhaps an expertise you can bring into the fore here to insightfully explain how these aircraft and procurement processes have been managed.
I will do my best.
Paul, take it away.
Harry, thank you. Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Should wait for my first slide to come up. I will begin with a comment that this is actually a little bit like being in a casino in Las Vegas, if any of you have ever been there. There are no clocks, and it's artificial light only, so you don't know what time of day it is. They don't mark the exits, whereas they do mark the exits in this place, so that is the sole difference between being here or, say, being in Caesar's Palace. The other difference is you are still taking a gamble, but you're not going to lose any money, you're just going to lose some of your time. The period I'll cover, nominally 1945 to 1955, I go outside that slightly, just to offer context. And you'll judge by the somewhat pessimistic subtitle that I have a somewhat jaundiced view of the procurement process at the time. It was essentially a series of opportunities that existed that could have been taken, but were generally either delayed or missed entirely, which was a great pity because it meant that the British aircraft industry and the Royal Air Force certainly underperformed as a result. There was an excessive ambition and a deficiency in terms of the resources to realise that ambition, and inevitably there was a falling short. To put in context the period and the actual activity that I wish to cover, there was clearly the end of World War II, and a huge amount of reconstruction requiring a huge amount of investment was needed pretty much around the world, certainly in Europe and not least in Britain itself. This obviously limited the amount of money available for developing advanced technologies, of which there were more than a few, particularly within the aviation industry. And the rate of change of the technology was extremely high. Obviously, the introduction of the jet engine with initially the German Messerschmitt 262 and then the British Gloster Meteor, that was transforming the nature of air power in combat aircraft. The introduction of swept wing technology, mainly from German research, which was adopted enthusiastically by the Americans, but rather less so by the British aircraft industry as a whole. And such issues, very challenging issues of looking at the transonic period, region of flight, and especially supersonic flight. This was a largely unknown area, particularly in this country where we lacked high-speed wind tunnels, with which it could be researched in relative safety as opposed to using manned aircraft. And other issues such as air-to-air missiles were also a factor, or for that matter, airborne radar. I can't cover everything. I will only be really skimming the surface. Now, it's easy to think of that period, 1945 to 1955, and indeed later than that, as being a series of classic aircraft which still attract a following today in various enthusiasts and appearances at air shows or in museums where the actual aircraft types are not necessarily airworthy. The Gloster Meteor, the first Western Allied jet fighter to enter service, somewhat after the ME-262. The English Electric Canberra, a light attack aircraft or a light bomber, very much in the mould of the de Havilland Mosquito. It was a relatively simple design in many ways, but very high performance aircraft nonetheless. And indeed, it was so good that it was even adopted by the United States Air Force, who paid it the ultimate compliment in terms of imitation as the sincerest form of flattery. And it was manufactured as the Martin B-57 and was in frontline service with the USAF until 1983. A fine aircraft. Certainly the Royal Air Force got its money's worth for that one. The beautiful Hawker Hunter, of course. The iconic Avro Vulcan, unfortunately no longer flying. The English Electric Lightning, with its stunning performance, particularly in terms of rate of climb, unfortunately that was not matched by its endurance. The pilot flew with one eye on the radar scope, one eye on the fuel gauge, and would then have to return to Binbrook very quickly, or find a tanker. The Blackburn Buccaneer, carved out of solid, and essentially the last real entirely British designed bomber to go into service with the Royal Air Force. The truly revolutionary Harrier, I admit here I'm going outside the 1955 period quite considerably, but it again is offering the context that there was the capability within the British aircraft industry to develop some revolutionary designs and actually put them into practice and into service. I have to mention TSR-2 in passing. That would have been the last all-British bomber entering service, but it was, of course, cancelled in the early 60s, as it was a fine example of very, very advanced technology trying to meet an extremely challenging specification. And that was a feature of many of the specifications issued by the Royal Air Force in the period which I wish to consider. And the technical challenge, particularly when funding was not exactly extensive, generally proved to be insurmountable. I think the last all-British aircraft to actually enter Royal Air Force service was the Hawk from British Aerospace. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I cannot claim to be an absolute authority on that point. And incidentally, if you do wish to ask a question during the lecture, I'm very happy to take a question as well as at the end, particularly if there's a point you wish to clarify. That's the flight line at RAF Valley, number 4 flying training school, where I spent 2 years and 7 months, including 3 winters. If you want to go to an interesting winter, go to Valley. It never snows, but the rain simply changes in temperature. And then we went into that period of international collaboration. It was the end of the British industry's ability to actually further projects on its own with government funding from Britain solely. The Anglo-French Jaguar, the Tri-National Tornado here in its attack form, and the Interceptor. I shall rattle through this quickly because they're not incredibly relevant. And of course then the current service Typhoon, the 4-nation Britain, Germany, Italy, Spain, here shepherding a Russian bear somewhere over the North Sea. You'll note that for some reason the bear is advertising on a national broadcaster. It's actually Cyrillic, so it's not quite correct. Anyway, if we go back to 1945 itself, I'm getting back on track here, the RAF was in what can only really be described as rude good health. It was very, very powerful indeed and very extensive and amply resourced in terms of aircraft of the day, but most of those were going to become obsolescent or obsolete really quite quickly. You can see for yourself the sheer scale of effort that had been applied to the RAF, not least to the combined bomber offensive over Germany, and the numbers speak for themselves. Unfortunately, this could not continue, not only because there was no need, given that the war had finished, but as the economist John Maynard Keynes informed the cabinet, that Britain as a nation, from the fiscal point of view, faced a financial Dunkirk. That scale of effort clearly could not be continued, and the changeover to the new technologies, the swept wing, the transonic flight, the jet engine, and so forth, that was also going to prove extremely challenging in a time of austerity. Such that by 1948, the number of operational aircraft and number of frontline aircraft had reduced by a factor of about 8, some 8 times reduction, and the number of personnel by about 3/4. That still is a staggering number of people. I think the current personnel of the Royal Air Force is about 31,000, and it is no longer really visible to the naked eye. There are undoubtedly strengths within the British industry at the time, and which continued for a while. We had produced some excellent aircraft, the Spitfire, Mosquito, Lancaster, excellent engine builders, primarily Rolls-Royce and Bristol. And we also had the first Allied jet fighter in service in the...
Sorry, sir.
Do you come in? Do you come in? Just let these gentlemen take a seat.
Yeah.
In the form of the Gloucester Meteor, and very importantly, we were also a world leader in the design, development, and production of jet engines. This was a true world lead. Admittedly, these were mainly centrifugal gas turbines as opposed to axial, which eventually came to predominate. But it was nevertheless a very great opportunity for British industry and for the Royal Air Force. However, if we compare ourselves to the American industry, although we had produced aircraft in the propeller-driven single-seat fighters, or even two-seat fighters, if you include things like the Mosquito and the Hornet, equivalent to US designs, we were definitely deficient when it came to very large, very long-range aircraft in the form both of the civil and military domains. There, in that case, the Americans were well ahead, and that lead was only to increase in the next 5-10 years and thereafter. Clearly, we only really got back into the running when we actually joined Airbus much, much later. Had that world lead in jet engines, even the Americans were buying them, or at least building them under license. And yet, despite this, by well before 1950, America had taken the lead in terms of the design, development, and build of advanced jet fighters. We had lost that lead we had. Crucial though it was at the time, we had somehow let it slip. And I'll try and expand on that a little in the next few minutes. Another interesting milestone in terms of industrial capacity and success, definitely going off piste here, but when it came to the vital area of car production and export, within 10 years of the war finishing, West Germany had actually exceeded Britain, despite the very extensive industry that we had in that area and the fact that it hadn't been bombed into rubble. Now, possibly that's helped the Germans because they could start from scratch with some modern machinery, as opposed to carrying on using 1920s type plant. But it is indicative of how the investment in advanced technology in Britain was arguably deficient. And clearly the West Germans were not particularly focused on designing and building weaponry at the time for obvious reasons. There was also the factor of the risks we were prepared to take, particularly with the lives of test pilots. Now, many test pilots were killed in this period at a rate that is absolutely frightening by today's standards. And projects such as the Miles M52 supersonic research aircraft was actually cancelled ostensibly on the grounds that it was too dangerous for a manned aircraft to actually fly at the speed of sound or try to penetrate the so-called sound barrier. And yet we accepted risks of this nature, 1952, and these horrendous losses. 500 aircraft written off, 232 fighters lost, 141 fighters killed, pilots killed, excuse me. That high chance of a fighter pilot dying in any one period. And yet the Air Ministry were really quite blasé about it, reassuring Churchill that it was normal and he need not worry in the least. And this is just unthinkable by today's standards. I can hardly remember the last time an RAF aircraft was lost, at least that's what I was planning to say, until that F-35B ended up in the Mediterranean. So I've had to change my mental script slightly. You know what I mean, I think. Another site we won't see again in terms of the resources available to us, 22 Hunters doing a formation loop. We can manage 9 Hawks these days. We're not going to see that again either. Not so much through risk, just through the cost. Anyway, there are various factors that played a major role in terms of how the industry developed and how the RAF devised its specifications for its next generation fighters, bombers, and all-weather interceptors, and so forth. There was the notion of prestige, that Britain had to have a role within the world as being a high-level game player, a world power. That was definitely a requirement, not just from the Conservatives, but from the Labour government under Clement Attlee from 1945. This was highly influential in terms of what was developed and what was procured. There was a desire that we should be self-sufficient in all aspects of the aircraft industry, both civil and military, and our attempts to actually achieve some level of success within the civil domain generally proved unsuccessful because we were playing catch-up with the Americans and we did not have the sufficient research and development resources to actually get anywhere close to them. All aircraft types were increasing in complexity and thereby increasing in cost. Transonic flight, the higher stresses on the airframes, the gas turbines themselves, airborne radar and so forth, air-to-air missiles, the costs were simply stacking up in all respects. And it was, if not unaffordable, it was certainly not affordable quickly. Particularly though there was the lack of resources within this country, lack of research and development facilities, in particular high-speed wind tunnels, which precluded any testing of transonic aircraft and their control behavior in that very unstable and uncertain region. the design and the manufacturing side, there were simply not enough graduate engineers within the UK, within the aircraft industry, to actually make progress at any reasonable rate. And essentially, there was also a lack of realism. The RAF was always focused on what it wanted as opposed to what it really needed, and the two were often completely mismatched. Essentially, they were demanding too much compared to the resources of the country in terms of its capacity to deliver. Just to give a quick indication of the rate of technological increase, if we go back to the early part of World War II, 1940, the Battle of Britain, a typical propeller-driven fighter could do about 350 miles an hour. Spitfire Mark I, the Messerschmitt Bf-109E. And 5 years later, the propeller fighters have gone up to about 450. So it's a substantial increase. But of course, the jets were promising far more. And by 1950, the start of the Korean War, there had been a substantial increase in speed, gas turbine swept wings, 650 miles an hour, an unimaginable speed for the late 1930s, 1940. And then another 10 years passed, and Mark II at altitude, 1,500 miles an hour, with the introduction of such aircraft as the Lightning, for example. And of course, all of this came at vast cost. Essentially, the cost of the individual aircraft, the unit cost, was rising at a similar rate, or at least something very like it. And the difference between British resources in the industry and those in the States, the research and development, the design, the manufacturing, was very, very marked indeed. 1943, there was a team led from Britain by Sir Roy Fedden of Bristol Engines to the States, looking at various American companies, and he was hugely impressed by what he found there. The Fedden report was dismissed to a large extent when it was published and circulated in Britain on his return, mainly because either people simply did not believe him or did not wish to believe him. And yet, he pointed out, and this was absolutely true, that the typical American firm had something between 5 to 7 times the technical and engineering graduate level of personnel available to them than the British aircraft industry, which to some extent was still run rather on a craft basis. Rules of thumb, the companies were often still run by their owners, who were generally self-taught engineers rather than academically trained graduate engineers. America had moved on and were not only different in style, but very different in scale as well. And this was shown up in a survey by the aviation author Bill Gunston. He looked at 180 combat aircraft programs following 1945. I'm not quite sure how late they went on, but it was a reasonable data set, so I think the conclusion is fairly reliable. We can have reasonable confidence within it, that on average, Britain took 2.5 times longer to develop and field an equivalent aircraft to the Americans. A comparison would be, say, the F-86 Sabre and the Hawker Hunter. Excuse me. And I mentioned the word prestige earlier. It recurs in various areas within Whitehall. Certainly in terms of foreign policy, the wish to remain a world power. Although the empire was being dismantled, there were some elements that were retained for quite some time. And this came at a cost, of course. And the desire for that prestigious role, that high profile of the nation within the world, led, amongst other things, even within the period of World War II itself, to the cabinet looking ahead and deciding we should build transatlantic type airliners to be a world leader in civil aviation as part of being a world-class power. Very ambitious, potentially achievable, providing you have the resources to apply to them to achieve the results you want within a reasonable space of time. And nearly always we did not. And so we had this national overambition, inevitably exceeding the resources available at that national scale. And unsurprisingly, of course, the result was underperformance. And the Americans, not only being much larger in scale and much more having much greater strength and depth in terms of their technical facilities and their technical personnel, they also had a different approach. They were prepared to go through an iterative process of design and development and take a series of short steps quickly in order to progress. We were tending to look for making a bigger step, almost skipping a generation in some cases, which sounds appealing, at least superficially, but is actually extremely difficult to achieve in reality. And although taking a series of short steps and developing a series of interim designs, which are cumulatively improved, it has a higher short-term cost, but almost without exception, it comes with higher cost effectiveness in the long term. We seem to be very resistant to actually adopting that notion and that approach. Such that the Americans, for example, they had the early adoption of the swept wing. The initial designs for the B-47 bomber and what became the F-86 Sabre fighter were designed with straight wings. And when their performance was in doubt, they could not meet the specified speeds and so forth, they readily adopted the swept wing approach based on the research data that had been captured and brought back from Germany. We did not do this. We hung onto straight wings for far too long, particularly in fighter aircraft, and in skipping a generation, we often tripped up. Now, priorities as ever. Governments do have to make difficult decisions. They were still rebuilding the housing stock, which had been severely damaged. There were the various industries with which they were hoping to gain income through export, such as the car industry, retooling from building tanks and trucks to building private cars again. But where was the money being spent? And in what the historian Corelli Barnett termed a neo-Edwardian foreign policy, there was still a lot of defence money being spent on overseas bases and overseas squadrons, east of Suez, well east of Suez. Although India became independent in 1948, there were many other parts of the old empire that remained in being, which required garrisoning with attendant costs. They desired to have a large blue water navy with many aircraft carriers. Understandable given Britain's position as a maritime power, but it does not come cheap. And the result was underinvestment in these high technology areas in which the Americans were moving ahead so quickly. And unbeknownst to us, the Russians were as well, as we were to find with great shock in 1950. Anyway, lost opportunities and ambition and reality. This reluctance to actually accept reality as it was, people preferring to see it as they hoped it would be, and this aspiration to improve was never really properly funded. But we had built some great aircraft. The famous Spitfire, I hardly need to tell you it's a Spitfire. Anyone know what mark?
14?
Nope. 12. First Griffin Spitfire.
It's a C5 though, isn't it? Big clip wings.
No, no,
The Mark 9 have
it's
wings.
various marks have clipped wings.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting off the track. I'm getting into spotter territory, which I'm very prone to do. The superlative Mosquito, arguably the best combat aircraft that Britain produced in the war, and the finest twin-engined multi-role aircraft of that period, or indeed of any time, you might say. So good that even the Americans used it, which is quite a compliment. And of course, the Lancaster, the backbone of Bomber Command as part of its strategic offensive. On the other hand, Avro's first attempt at a large civil aircraft, actually it wasn't that large compared to the American equivalents, the Avro Tudor was a failure with some severe control problems, and its time in service was generally flawed by various aircraft crashing or simply disappearing. It was an unhappy follow-on to the Lancaster's success, but proof that it was not straightforward to build a large, successful civil airliner. It was far more than just a bomber with some seats in the back. The transatlantic aspiration, the Bristol Brabazon, for some reason this contract was given to Bristol, who had no experience with very large aircraft, so that was a questionable decision in the first place. And it faced such issues as suitable power plants, pressurization, and its underperformance caused it to never actually enter service. I think only about 2 were ever built, both in prototype form. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong. It could not get high enough. It was not, and they found it was not flying through very, very gentle air, but facing severe turbulence, which was somewhat of a surprise, unpleasant surprise at the time. Here we have an example where a company, Sanders Rowe in this case, they produced a pretty reasonable design, but one that was directed at a flawed concept. And it was not the only flawed concept within British civil and military aviation during that period. If you want to build a large aircraft with a long range, yes, it needs a long way to take off, but it's much easier to build a long runway than to build the facilities for actually handling a very large flying boat, both at the home base and your various overseas destinations. Sole success on the civil side, I think, in that period was the Vickers Viscount, first turboprop-powered airliner, which showed it could be done. It was not that the British aircraft industry lacked talent. It was a question of when the specification was actually sensible and based on a real requirement that had a commercial application or a true military application with potential for export as well, that we actually had success. But this was very, very much intermittent. Few and far between were the hits compared to the misses. If you want to read a book about British aircraft procurement, or well, at least the attempt to procure, and very often failure to do so, from the post-war period, try Project Cancelled by Derek Wood, and I would recommend the second edition, which is rather more extensive than the first. Fascinating book. It covers both the technical aspects and also the political, and it's well worth a look. Out of print at the moment, I think, but you can find it on second-hand book sites. And two of the main points that Derek Wood makes in that book, Project Cancelled, was that there was the lack of a consistently applied long-term strategy for the civil and the military sides of aviation within this country. There were too many changes, too frequent, and the result was confusion and often failure, rather than there being a clear-sighted long-term goal. And another point on which he is particularly critical is the Royal Air Force, forever seeking the ideal solution to what they perceived as being an operational problem or challenge, and writing very, very optimistic and very challenging specifications, so producing aircraft which had zero chance of export success. The Americans did not always go for the absolute best. They produced aircraft that had export appeal, and indeed, in turn, the French did so as well, with the Mirage being the obvious example. Looking at the weaknesses then of the UK aircraft industry, there were definitely too many companies. There were too many projects. There were a lot of good ideas knocking around and some not so good ideas as well. But the lack of money meant that, of course, no one project was particularly well funded. Well, actually, the V-bombers were fairly well funded, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the majority of projects ran extremely slowly as a result. There was also this tendency to duplicate the types that were in design and development and even in procurement. And this was a very, very costly way of doing business. It appears to have been applied partly to keep certain firms in business. So there was a political, commercial, and economic imperative rather than a purely military one. When we had duplication of types, we had small procurements. The unit cost went up inevitably, not only in terms of the aircraft themselves, but the infrastructure required to support them. There was also a lack of cooperation between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, the two seeming to regard each other with more suspicion than they did with regard to potential enemies. Somewhat blasé about the threat from the Soviet Union by comparison. And as I've mentioned, that disregard of export potential in any particular specification or design. And to give you an indication of the number of companies that were extant, the blue bar represents airframe builders and the red engine builders. And it was not until the 60s that it was actually reduced to a reasonable number. Arguably, even then, 5 airframe builders was too many for a nation of this size. Of course, many of those were really quite small. You had the giants, Vickers, Avro, and so forth. And there were many small companies that had some very good design staff and came up with some very interesting concepts with potential, but they in no way had the resources to actually develop them at any rate or even at all. And the rationalisation was arguably long delayed and too slow. Going back to Project Cancelled and Derek Wood, he mentions in that period 48 to 58, some 121 major British aircraft projects being at some stage of development, and of those 113 were cancelled with some level of loss as a result of the sunk funds, the sunk costs already invested. And there was also this stop-go approach, that lack of a consistent long-term policy application meant that you had a period of stagnation and then a desperate rush to catch up. The Korean War being an example of an imperative to actually do something. The good ideas and concepts that were around, but they didn't really fit into a strategy, and the money was not there in any case. And we are very cautious in some ways, such as the very reluctant development of swept-wing aircraft and the application of the gas turbine, for example, in fleet air arm aircraft for carrier operations. And then on other occasions, we were extremely ambitious, writing some specifications that were incredibly challenging and would have been extremely challenging for the American industry to actually develop, let alone the British industry. The RAF at times being really very unrealistic. There was the complacency within the government and probably the Air Ministry as well. It was assumed at the end of World War II there would be no further war for another 10 years. Of course, within 5 years, the Korean War began, so that particular assumption proved very much awry. The failure to focus on exports, as I've said, and then another particular failing that is peculiar to the British aircraft industry, that even when we actually developed and fielded an aircraft which was capable and had potential for further development and improvement, we often failed to take that opportunity. I'll get to a couple in a moment, but another that springs to mind would be the Buccaneer, for example. Very capable aircraft, but once it was in service, it actually received very little in the way of further development, despite it actually definitely having the potential for doing so. The slow pace overall and not enough graduate engineers. I'll throw that in just in case there are any graduate engineers here looking for a job in industry. There will be a vacancy, I can assure you. Here we have an example of a somewhat ambitious specification from 1954, looking at an advanced, very high speed, very high altitude reconnaissance aircraft, a maximum speed of Mach 3, cruising at Mach 2.5, 5,000 nautical mile range, and ceiling of 66,000 feet. I would suggest that with those sort of performance figures, it could get much higher than that, probably more like 80,000. This essentially is an SR-71 Blackbird. It was cancelled at the right time on the drawing board, as I think there would be no prospect really for the British industry producing that at anything like an affordable cost or within a reasonable time period. Unfortunately, that didn't always happen. The cancellation was often rather later, and therefore the sunk cost was greater. Various factors combined to guide what passed for a strategy, although it was really very ad hoc, hand-to-mouth approach. Britain had decided that it needed its own independent nuclear deterrent, and in those days, such a weapon was delivered by an airborne bomb, and a bomb requires a bomber. And so there was a focus on bomber development post-war, which led somewhat to a stagnation in fighter design, or certainly in fighter development. There was also the tendency to go for insurance policy designs, very much for the V-bomber force. And then we had that big shock when the MiG-15 turned up in 1950, and it turned out to be much, much better than anything that the Royal Air Force actually had available or was likely to become available in the near future. And regional aircraft were potentially available during this time if the Air Force had been prepared to accept an interim option. But it was focused on the best, and the best is the enemy of the good. And so capable designs with much potential were ignored and dismissed and underfunded, while the Air Force waited for something much better to turn up tomorrow. And very often, of course, it didn't turn up tomorrow, it turned up a week after that, or years later. And this duplication approach, is this prudent insurance at a time of very great technical challenge, such that you actually increase the chance of a particular design proving capable, or are you just dividing your resources and thereby increasing the chance of failure and certainly a delay in both cases? It very much depends on the circumstances, and it's a matter of opinion. I cannot offer a conclusive or a definitive opinion in this particular case, but it applied to both fighters, bombers, and all-weather interceptors. Now, the pragmatic approach in some cases would have been to swallow our pride and adopted the American solution, looking for something off the shelf from the States, which would, of course, would have meant money going out of this country abroad, but at least it would have been a known quantity, and the unit costs, given the procurement size of the United States Air Force, would probably have been quite low, and there would have been that mutual benefit of learning from them. And there was one example of this. The Avro Lancaster, actually based on, I think, a 1934 specification originally, by the end of the war was really getting a little long in the tooth. It was developed into a somewhat longer range version, the Lincoln, wingspan increase, fuel increase, but still essentially an aircraft of the early 40s. A longer range aircraft was potentially available in the form of the Windsor from Vickers, one of Barnes Wallace's designs. It had a longer range, higher altitude than the Lancaster or the Lincoln, but it was developed only in prototype stage by the end of the war. And what I think is arguably the sensible solution was made of not to take its development any further, given the high cost of actually putting it into manufacture, the likely small numbers that would be bought, given that the Air Force at that time was focused on getting jet-powered V-bombers to deliver the nuclear deterrent. And instead, we bought, or at least we borrowed, B-29 Superfortresses from the States. They were taken out of storage. I think we had 87 in the end. And in RAF service, it was known as the Washington. And this had a considerably better payload radius than the Lancaster, Lincoln, and for that matter, the Windsor, as you can see here. All of these aircraft carrying a 14,000 pound payload. The incremental increase from Lancaster through Lincoln to Windsor as their size and weight goes up, but no comparison with the B-29 Superfortress Washington. This was a good decision. We could have developed the Windsor, but it wouldn't have been that much better. So we went off the shelf to the States and got something that was, yes, an interim design, an interim aircraft for our requirements, but a very capable one, and one that was also timely. So we have the nuclear deterrent, the focus on bomber development, and the insurance policy design approach. That applied with a vengeance to the V-bomber program. The operational requirement specified carrying a 10,000 pound load to Moscow, the first British nuclear deterrent, first British atom bomb, a fission weapon. I think it required a bomb bay something like 10 feet in diameter and 30 feet long. It was a massive piece of kit. So lugging one of those to Moscow was pretty demanding. And not only was the range payload demanding, but the actual performance involved or required was very challenging as well. Cruise speed of some 500 knots, the ability to go over the target at 50,000 feet, which was believed to be out of the range of any form of aircraft advance, be it anti-aircraft artillery or fighters. The performance compared to the Lancaster was just unbelievable. And despite the parlous financial state we were in, within a 2.5-year period, 5 different prototype aircraft aimed at that requirement actually flew. We essentially didn't just duplicate, but what is the triplicate, whatever it is for 5 times, quintuplicate. Of those 5 prototype aircraft that flew within that 2.5-year period, some 3 of them actually entered service. Initially the Vickers Valiant, the Vulcan again, and the somewhat lesser known Handley Page Victor, which never seemed to attract the same attention as the Vulcan for some reason, although it was a very advanced design in its own right. The specification went out to industry, 6 companies bid, and the Avro and the Handley Page tenders were accepted, eventually becoming the Vulcan and the Victor. And then there was suddenly some concern that those were such demanding specifications and such complex aircraft that we should go for something simpler. And so another specification was issued with the emphasis on simplicity and specifically low risk. And the Short Company of Belfast came up with their design, the Sperrin, to meet that. And then Vickers came back, its initial design had been rejected, and it said, well, you've gone for one insurance policy interim aircraft in the form of the Sperrin, we can do something as well. And this was accepted. So at that stage, there were 4 aircraft in development for one requirement. The Vickers aircraft, the Valiant, it actually flew a mere 27 months after contract, which is actually extremely quick. This is the Short Sperrin, a very, very low-risk aircraft indeed. It was described as being essentially a traditional aircraft with jet engines. You can see the emphasis is on simplicity. The aerodynamics are very, very conventional, essentially 1945. It's not really a swept wing design. I think it's just the fact that the leading edge is cranked back a little. And 2 pairs of engines on either side in a vertical stack, which is quite rare. And a somewhat uninspiring design, but it met the specification at which it was aimed. And in terms of first flight, we then had May 1951 for the Valiant, 18 months later, the Vulcan, and then just a couple of months after that, the Victor. So 4 aircraft flying within a very short space of time, all aimed roughly at the same mission. And then Vickers, they were hyperactive at this stage. They came out with a radically developed version of the Valiant in the form of the Mark II. it looked superficially similar, but was actually considerably better, considerably faster, and also specifically stressed for low-level operations. So we have, unlike the Americans, 5 different aircraft flying within a 2.5-year period, all intended really to do the same thing, with pretty much the same performance. The emphasis being on the pretty much. This was expensive. This was arguably a waste of very scarce funds. There should have been greater scrutiny and assessment of the original designs and an early decision made before putting so many prototypes into the air. Then we had the eventual selection. 3 different aircraft entered service. The Valiant in 1955, the Vulcan, again about 18 months later, and then the Victor another 18 months after that. Relatively small numbers in each case. So high unit cost, 3 different aircraft, which you need 3 forms of infrastructure, 3 forms of training for the technicians and the crews. This triplication in complexity and cost within the organisation of the Air Force. The Air Force were happy. On the other hand, the United States Air Force went through an iterative and cumulative approach looking at improvement, such that they had the B-36, which was a piston engine propeller-driven aircraft with intercontinental range, in use as early as 1949. Then they had their jet-powered B-47, came in 1951, long before any of our B-bombers did, and the B-52 in 1955, just as the Valiant, which essentially was an interim design, eventually entered service. So a very, very different approach. They would have looked at contending designs from different companies for each of those aircraft types, but then they selected one and focused on it. So they have this series of short steps, more expensive in the short term perhaps, but highly cost effective in the long term. And undoubtedly so in the case of the B-52, which I think is currently scheduled to continue in service until about 2045, if not later. And this profligacy, if I can say that, continued in the Royal Air Force. 1960, 11 squadrons operating under the Valiant, Vulcan, and Victor, rising to 23 by 1963. And surprisingly, the Treasury did not insist on the RAF choosing between the Vulcan and the Victor. Normally they were quite, the Treasury obviously had a very powerful voice in these matters, but the RAF dug its heels in and said they couldn't possibly choose between the 2 designs until they actually had both of them in service, and then having got both of them into service, they retained both in service. And all of this, of course, was money that could not be spent elsewhere, such as on fighter design. And this was the outcome. The Sperrin never went beyond prototypes. The Valiant Mark I, famously, infamously, was taken out of service owing to metal fatigue. The Vulcan and the Victor not only were both adopted into service in their Mark I form, but both were then developed to Mark II status and continued in service. They then switched to low-level flight when it was realized that the high-altitude approach was simply impossible to achieve given Soviet air defenses. The Victor did not like the low-level stressing it got and reverted to a air-to-air refueling role at altitude. And ironically, the aircraft that was specifically designed for low level, the Valiant Mark II, was never adopted, and that opportunity was lost. It was never actually resurrected when the low-level change in the mission profile was adopted. While this was all going on with the V-Force, or the incipient V-Force, the light attack area was covered by the Canberra from English Electric, essentially a jet-powered Mosquito, a relatively simple design, but a very effective one, as I mentioned. And a short time between its first flight and its service entry. And it had its teething problems undoubtedly, but it was still a very effective aircraft. And the interesting thing is that as far as I can tell, there was no insurance policy design adopted for the Canberra, either because it was decided that it was not so important as to merit that, or there was sufficient confidence in English Electric in designing this particular aircraft and developing it for service use, that there was no need for an insurance policy duplication. In the event, the Americans developed it rather further than we did, and arguably that was, again, lost potential within the Canberra itself. We used it in the photographic reconnaissance role for many years, but we actually removed it from the attack role relatively early on. And there certainly was a reasonable amount of money around at the time. 1951 defence budget, somewhat over £750 million, of which just over 31% was available for equipment production. So this is, for the time itself, not a small amount of money by any means, but it was spread very thinly. There was that double demand on the defence budget, with the UK playing a world power role, top table, one of the permanent 5 at the United Nations, but also facing the requirement to defend the UK and also Western Europe as its contribution to NATO. And still striving to be self-sufficient in military hardware. That procurement, that borrowing of the B-29, that did not become a precedent. It was not really repeated very much. It was in one particular area, which I'll come to in a moment. But that self-sufficiency was actually, although laudable in some respects, was quite crippling in other respects. And the diversity of aircraft around at the time was incredible. I mean, this came as a big surprise to me. Ministry of Supply in June 1950, stating that 35, quote, highly different aircraft types were in current manufacture. This is both civil and military, probably ranging from really quite small aircraft all the way up to things like the Vulcan, with another 35 types under development and 19 different aircraft manufacturers. This is just excessive. Gives an idea of the rate of change within the British industry and its overseas competitors, be they allies or potential adversaries. And considering fighter aircraft, and specifically the change from straight-wing fighters to swept-wing. Britain produced that early straight-wing jet fighter, the Meteor, which came out in various versions, including as late as 1950 in the Mark 8, when it was definitely obsolescent, if not obsolete. There was also its stablemate, the de Havilland Vampire, and its close relative, and the Vampire's close relative, the de Havilland Venom. Straight-wing designs again, introduced as late as 1952. This was long after the rest of the world had moved on, and this slow pace in adopting this new technology that had so much to offer is very surprising. America did a couple of straight-wing aircraft, Lockheed P-80, F-84 Thunder Chief, which I think also had a swept-wing variant. But then both Russia and America went very hot on swept-wing designs. In 1948, the MiG-15 swept-wing fighter came into service and then operated to our horror during the Korean War. 1949, the North American F-86 Sabre, a very fine aircraft. And then as early as 1951, Sweden, in the form of Saab, introduced the swept-wing J-29-ton jet fighter. Now, Sweden is a country with a population the size of London, and yet they managed to beat us by 3 years in putting into service a swept-wing fighter. How was this possible? It was not simply because the Swedes had adopted a pragmatic and focused approach to what they required, not what they necessarily wanted, but what they required and what was achievable, but they then put that into action single-mindedly, while we were generally faffing about. Indeed, we had to import F-86 Sabres, actually built in Canada, not in America itself, in late 1952, 1953, as an interim, because we had nothing comparable at the time. The Hawker Hunter and the Supermarine Swift did not appear until 1954. The Hunter then took 2 years to actually become effective as a fighter. And the Swift, that was essentially a failure in all fighter and interceptor roles. It had some success as a low-level reconnaissance aircraft. But why was this so late? Was there an inherent distrust of German technology, a parochial view that we won the war, so we could have nothing to learn from Germany? The cottage industry approach of British industry itself, that we simply carry on with our rules of thumb approach and doing a bit of metal bashing without any serious research. I think all of those factors combined. Meanwhile, the rest of the world had gone supersonic. The North American F-100 Super Sabre in 1954, contemporaneous with the firmly transonic Hunter. The Super Sabre, I think, could do about Mach 1.2, 1.3. the Russian MiG-19, 1955, and then 1956, the all-weather interceptor, the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger. Supersonic aircraft again. And our own all-weather interceptor that was introduced to the RAF at that period was firmly transonic. And if you've ever seen a Javelin, given the thickness of the wing, it was never going to go through the sound barrier. We were trailing. We had lost whatever lead we had in jet fighter or jet-powered combat aircraft technology. If you've never seen the Saab J-29 Tunnan, this is what it looks like. Got its nickname the Tunnan, which is Swedish for barrel. It's rather portly lines, but a very advanced aircraft. The first Western European fighter to enter service with a swept wing. It also had a flying tail, which the Hunter did not get, or at least not get in the full form for some years after its introduction. And in terms of fighter design, the two main builders of fighter aircraft during World War II, Hawker and Supermarine, they rather got sidelined in the post-war period. Gloucester and de Havilland, building respectively the Meteor and the Vampire, came to the fore simply because they had the capacity at the time, and then having got that place, retained it. Hawker had produced, of course, the Hurricane, the Typhoon and the Tempest. Supermarine, it produced the Attacker, top left, a rather lackluster, underperforming jet fighter, straight wing as you can see. It also was a tailwheel aircraft when pretty much everyone else in the world had gone on to nose wheel. And their eventual competitor to the Hawker Hunter in the form of the Swift, as I mentioned, a singularly unsuccessful design, suffering many control problems at transonic speed, and the lack of those advanced research facilities, high-speed wind tunnels, was a major factor in that failure. We fell behind the competition. The Russians moved ahead, the Americans moved ahead, and unbelievably, the Swedes moved ahead as well. And yet there was potential that Hawker had that was not exploited. The Meteor definitely outlived its welcome, not leaving frontline service until 1957. The Vampire was around for rather less time. It did pull off, interestingly, the first ever jet aircraft landing on an aircraft carrier as early as December 1945, and yet that promising start was not carried on. The Navy retained its interest in propeller-driven aircraft and viewed jet aircraft with some suspicion. The leading engine around 1945, or certainly the late 40s, was the Rolls-Royce Nene, a centrifugal compressor gas turbine of about 5,000 pounds thrust. Despite its excellence, remarkably, the RAF managed never to adopt an aircraft that used this engine. It was extensively used in this aircraft. Just after the war, the Russians knew that Britain was in the lead in jet engines, and so somebody suggested, why don't we just buy some from Britain? The idea was put to Stalin. He said, don't be stupid, only a fool would sell his secrets. We've duly sold.
The Americans never forgive us for that.
Probably not, saying it turned up in the MiG-15.
Oh,
They-
5 minutes.
Hmm?
5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm going to have to speed up or finish early. We also did not really exploit turboprops. There were early efforts here on the Gloucester Meteor, but only ever one turboprop combat aircraft entered service, which was the Western Wyvern with the Fleet Aeron. This was a useful step between piston engine propeller aircraft and full gas turbine jet aircraft, and yet for some reason that option was never really developed or adopted to any great extent. The Hunter eventually came into service, but it took 2 years to get right. First flying as late as 1951, in the middle of the Korean War. We had to buy the Sabre, as I said, as that interim, again, rather embarrassing. I'll just flip through that quickly. We did do some swept wing research. The de Havilland D-108 Swallow broke the sound barrier. 3 prototypes were built, but all crashed fatally. Again, had high-speed wind tunnels been available, maybe those control problems could have been properly researched and sorted out to make an aircraft that was actually safe for operational use. But clearly, 3 prototypes crashing fatally, that was hardly a good foundation for squadron service. And then the only use of the Rolls-Royce Nene was in prototype aircraft such as this Hawker effort, the 1040, bifurcated jet pipes. It eventually entered service with the Navy, but some 5.5 years later when it was already obsolete. Straight wing, well out of date. A swept wing version was experimented with, but never adopted by either the Fleet Air Arm or the Royal Air Force. It would have made a very capable interim fighter and potentially in service in time for the Korean War. And then a version with a straight through jet pipe rather than the bifurcated jet pipe was developed, and a swept tailplane as well as the swept main plane. Again, within a reasonable space of time and a reasonable rate of development, it could have been available years before the Hunter and in time for the Korean War. But the RAF were content to wait for the Hunter, and the Hunter turned up late. This was not available and was never seriously adopted or considered. The family resemblance is quite clear. I better just flick through these, and yeah, that is the Hunter predecessor. As you can see, its speed compared very well with the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15. And between sea level and 30,000 feet, it compared well with the Sabre. It could have been in service years before the Hunter. Okay, there was a supersonic version of the Hunter considered. Greater sweep on the wing, thinner wing. Again, not adopted because we wanted something better. The RAF were content to wait for the Lightning. We lost out on exports in this respect. And when you actually look at the numbers of aircraft we sold compared to the Americans with the Sabre and then the Super Sabre, we fell well short. And worse than that, we had an aircraft rather similar to the Mirage 3, broke the world speed record in 1956 by the biggest ever increment, and we then ignored it. It was extremely similar to the Mirage in both size and general arrangement. And then if you look at the number of supersonic fighters we eventually built compared to our competitors, America and France, there is just no comparison. The sole supersonic fighter that Britain's ever produced, being a Lightning, built in a pitiful small number compared to the Starfighter, the Mirage, and the Super Sabre. Okay, so just, yeah, lots of potential. The Hawker interim designs, they could have been better developed. We could have had a supersonic Hunter. We could have converted that Ferry Delta II into a Mark II interceptor and picked up some of the market that the Dassault Mirage achieved. And that's pretty much it. Great potential, but wasted opportunities. The demand of the VLON program on scarce funds, scarce resources thinly spread, slow progress, and promising designs not exploited. At which point I will have to finish as I'm getting the signal.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. For our online audience, it's about to go silent whilst I unplug. We're back in the room, Paul. It's great. I really enjoyed the talk. I think there's some really interesting aspects to come out of it, particularly the challenge around protecting your defence technology industrial base and developing for an export market, but also trying to meet service needs. And was the problem that Britain really had, you feel, that the RAF just always emphasised service needs, the very, very best, aspirational at all times, and didn't step back and consider what it needed longer term and what the industry needed longer term?
I think both of those factors really applied. The overambition of the Air Force in many cases was a distraction. It led to those highly challenging specifications that had little prospect of being developed, at least in a timely manner, and certainly at an affordable cost. And their resistance to the notion of actually tailoring any of their demands such that it would actually have export potential was short-sighted, to say the least. And this was despite the fact that they were happy with the Meteor and Vampire that sold very well internationally, and why they should not have considered that as being a path to continue is difficult. I think it was just a question of overambition.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so we're going to take some questions from the room, but online, if you want to use the ask a question function, and then we'll put the questions to Paul, test him as much as possible. But yes.
First, 2 comments and then a question. A lot of people don't realise the B29 project actually cost more than the Manhattan project.
It did, yes.
Yeah, it was a massive investment, which, you know, that goes back to your thing about the American
I think
investment.
4 billion.
The other comment that I'd like to make is the fact that the Americans made mistakes as well, like with the B-36, the Peacemaker, which was basically obsolete design. And my question is, do you think that the fact that the Americans and Russians had access to German research technology had a bearing on their leads?
I think without a doubt, and but particularly their readiness to actually adopt it and to apply it and then actually field it. Whereas, as I think I mentioned, there was a reluctance within some parts of British aviation to take what they saw as being the findings of the losing side. The readiness to actually adopt the new technology for transonic flight and eventually supersonic flight allowed the Americans and the Russians to build that lead, and of course they have never lost it.
I mean, you made the comment about the wind tunnel test. The Germans were actually world leaders, weren't they, in wind tunnels?
Yeah, I think we stole one of the wind tunnels, but
I keep hearing about the debates in the United States Air Force about whether to retain the internal gun or to ditch it altogether for air-to-air missiles. Was there ever such a debate in the RAF at the time, or was there a belief that there was going to be a need for an internal gun on their fighters specifically?
the gun was only retained for the Hunter. It was also retained initially, at least, for the Javelin, which was also missile armed. But then you have the example, for example, from the Sea Vixen, which was a pure missile armed aircraft and never had a gun. So opinion differed somewhat. There wasn't an abrupt change in policy such that everything before one particular date had a gun and everything after that did not. Mm-hmm. And we saw the original Tornado, both in the ground attack form and the interceptor form, retained 27mm cannon, and the Typhoon still has a cannon. So guns persist, but I think the persistence of the gun was the lesson learned by the Americans, where having gone to all missile aircraft, such as the Phantom originally, they realised it was a mistake, and they were prepared to actually correct that mistake. The Air Force, certainly the British examples, you don't have that such a large succession of aircraft from one generation to the next to track that thinking. The Hunter had the gun, the four cannons. The Lightning, I think, had 2 cannons, if I remember correctly. I forget exactly. Yes, I think we generally retained both the gun and the missile approach, but I'm not well read on that particular subject.
Okay, I'm going to come to you in a moment, sir. So we've got a question which is, so what has changed since? Because today we've had H2S cancelled, NHS computers, and the online question is, how have things changed? But I think what I want to put to you is, are there lessons we can take from this period in terms of how do you plan strategically to get the most out of what you're trying to invest and procure in?
The main issue, I believe, is realism, and to understand what is affordable and develop the best that you can achieve from your given funds, as opposed to thirsting after the unattainable and the unaffordable.
Brilliant.
Yes. Would you argue that the development of the jet fighter after 1945 was impacted mainly by the switch from a wartime economy to a civilian economy? Because obviously you've said that it goes quickly down, how quickly the industry changed and then sort of shrunk within that period. Would you argue that was a cause of kind of why we fell behind?
The industry shrank in terms of the sheer number of aircraft being built compared to the wartime years, because although the peacetime loss rates are very high, they did not compare to wartime. But I think it was the failure to actually rationalise the industry at a reasonable rate that had a major effect. The thinly spread design staff that's actually existed were inefficiently applied, with really quite small companies being unable to further concepts at anything like a reasonable rate. And this is where the government must step in and actually take drastic action. Some people might say, we have to leave this to market forces. But in the case of military aircraft, of course, the government is the market force. And many of the companies were still run by their founders, and they were very resistant to amalgamation, but it was a question really of national requirement and the imperative to actually devise an efficient and effective aircraft industry. And I think the governments of the day should have been much stricter in insisting on amalgamation much quicker and bringing together these disparate design staff into fewer but much larger groups. And I believe the result would have been faster progress and better results. So rationalisation, I think, would have been not a panacea, far from it, because funds were still scarce compared to the ambitions, but that concentration of the design effort that existed would have made for far better output.
Okay, also we've got a question from online, and it's why were the Air Ministry specifications so wrong or misguided, both in terms of the civilian and the military sector?
I can't speak so much for the civil sector, as I don't know so much about it. There were certainly errors in the civil sector, the famous one being the Trident being scaled down in size and then losing out to the 727 in the civil market. Really, that was through a failure of ambition on the part of BEA, the opposite of the excessive ambition on the part of the RAF. I think it was this desire to remain a world power and the belief that we still had to be producing aircraft that were absolutely equal to that of America, if possible. And yet, despite repeated failure or repeated delay, in which we did not actually achieve that state, the desire remained, and that bad habit persisted. So it was that lack of realism. And the example of Sweden, I think, serves very well to illustrate how a country can actually come up with a rational national strategy which is not only affordable, but produces aircraft of high quality at what appears to be an affordable cost.
Do you have a question in the room? Yes.
In regards to like the B-36 program, that was initiated at the beginning of the Second World War because the Americans envisaged having the requirements for a long-range bomber.
Intercontinental, yes.
Yeah, because they thought that Britain wouldn't be available. Yeah. Now, would it be fair to say that then Britain itself at the end of the war was caught on the hop because they suddenly discovered they needed a strategic long-range bomber that they didn't envisage before, the V bomber force attacking Russia, which was, I mean, the Lincoln, the Lancaster were brilliant aircraft within their capabilities, but they were never envisaged as being a strategic long-range force, were they?
Not strategic and long-range in the sense that those words eventually came to mean, and the driving imperative was very much the deterrent, which meant Moscow, given the size of the bomb, you needed a large aircraft, to say nothing of the range, the large aircraft size you needed in order to have that radius of action. So it was very much driven by the decision of Britain to adopt an independent deterrent and thereby need the delivery system. Because clearly the Lincoln, or for that matter, even the Windsor, would have been utterly inadequate in that role.
So really we were caught on the hop, weren't we? In fairness.
Not so much on the hop, it's simply it was a question of America having the capacity to build things like the B-36 while the war was, or at least to develop it while the war was still ongoing, whereas that was simply beyond our resources at the time. We were entirely focused on building Lancasters in very large numbers. I think we built something like 7,700 of the things eventually, but at the end of the war, of course, they were surplus to requirement.
Would stubbornness also play a role in the RAF and potentially the Fleet Air Arm's refusal to go for what was the good option rather than what they envisioned to be the better option?
Very much so, yes. And I think this persists till today, in that the various fleets we have within the RAF in terms of aircraft, or the Fleet Air Arm with aircraft, F-35, F-35B, or the Navy's warships, the Type 45 destroyer. Originally, it was planned to buy 12 of them to act as the escorts for the carriers. We've ended up with 6 because they turned out to be just horrendously expensive. Very, very advanced, undoubtedly, but horrendously expensive at about £1 billion each, I believe. And yes, it is this view of ourselves as this tier 1 military power, well, I remember Theresa May refused to actually confirm that we had that position or intention. And I should take a bit of a punt here and say, okay, no, we haven't been a tier 1 military power for decades. We've got to be more realistic in these things. So yeah, there was that stubbornness to somehow see ourselves as United States Air Force Tribute Act. And it doesn't work.
Thank you.
As the naval historian, Professor Eric Grove, said that we've long had the ability and resources to be a first-rate example of a military power of the second rank. But our desire to be in the first rank means we end up being second-rate.
Okay, so we've had a question from Nigel online. I think it's a really nice one to touch on because I think this period, as you've emphasised, one of failure despite opportunities. But the subsequent period, it's often seen as a failure based on the move towards the Sandy Report, missiles, bad undercutting, fighter development. So how do the two tie in? I mean, in your view, how important was Sandy to the failures? Is this period the really crucial one?
It was very, very important, obviously, for the industry, with the number of programmes cancelled at the time. There was actually a Royal Aeronautical Society conference specifically on the 1957 Defence White Paper back in 2017. And I think it's available online, so I'd recommend anyone who can actually find that to listen to the various presentations made at the time. Doesn't include me, I was in the audience, but well worth listening to. I think the SANS report recognised that there were too many programmes, too many of which were too expensive. Some of the ones that got the chop did not deserve it, and some of the ones that continued perhaps should have got it in the neck earlier. Of course, we're speaking with hindsight. The belief that we could do everything with surface-to-air missiles was mistaken, and that had a major adverse effect on the British aircraft industry, but it was hardly in an ideal state at the time anyway. It wasn't as though it was blooming with health and selling vast numbers of aircraft overseas. Had we actually taken a more rational approach and had a better export potential within our aircraft fleets at the time, I think we'd have had less of an emphasis on the surface-to-air missile side. The government at the time saw the aircraft industry as essentially just being this black hole, because too many projects had absorbed vast amounts of money to either produce nothing or aircraft that fell well short of the specifications, such as the Supermarine Swift. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure I have actually answered it.
I hope so. I'm not going to read it out again.
Me too.
Do you have any questions for Ray? Okay, so this one comes from Alistair. He says, although it's outside your talk's parameter, there were successes for P1127 and failures for TSR2, infamously. We can't go very long without mentioning the TSR2 here. And that must have had their requirement specifications in the 1950s. So could you speak to those and how they fitted with procurement?
Well, the TSR2 originally harked back to a Canberra replacement. And although the title includes the word tactical strike and reconnaissance, it became essentially something approaching an aircraft's strategic range. Combining that capability with short takeoff and landing rough field performance was excessive, and there was simply too many technologies, new airframe, new engines, new avionics, all combined in one go. It is the classic example of an overly ambitious specification, a 1,000 nautical mile radius of action at low level. The 1,000 miles appears to have been almost conjured out of thin air. A nice round number, but was it really a requirement? The P1127, that of course became the original Harrier, the AV-8A, essentially was a continuation of the work that had begun on the P1154, the supersonic V-STOVL aircraft, which sensibly was cancelled because it was such a demanding specification, and one that was almost doomed to failure. So I do not regret the fact that the 1154 was cancelled. TSR2, had it been designed to an 80% specification of its original rates of action requirement and maybe delete the rough field performance capability, it would have been affordable and would probably still be in service.
I think really glad you touched on the Buccaneer in your talk, because we've come on to the TSR2 and you've just described a specification which the Buccaneer might have won. So how much of this is the refusal of the RAF to see capabilities that they could have developed quite effectively? There's often a debate about developing the Buccaneer because of the cost of taking on an existing type.
Yeah.
But also looking at, is that a more exportable type? How do those two things tie in? Because the RAF was completely resistant to the Buccaneer.
Yes.
There are sort of service factors which
Absolutely.
come
The irony, of course, is that when the RAF finally adopted the Buccaneer, reluctantly, they actually loved it. It never had the capability to meet the original TSR2 specification, and would have required massive change to come close to it. In terms of export potential, it was sold to South Africa. I don't think there were any other likely customers, possibly the Australians, but they were focused on the F-111 at the time. And yes, it undoubtedly had much more potential than was ever fully realised. There is a book written by one of the chief designer of the Buccaneer, Roy Boot, which is worth looking at. He runs through various of the options, reheat, different undercarriage. I think they probably would have deleted the folding wing to save weight. I think the fact that it was a naval aircraft was a factor in the RAF being resistant to it. They disliked the notion of adopting it. You had the further irony, they eventually adopted the Phantom, which even USAF adopted and then found they liked. The Navy are often rather more realistic because they had to be, given the challenges of operating from a carrier.
Absolutely. Okay, do we have any questions in the room? Okay, we've got one from Dr. Anthony Gee online. He says it's a very useful reminder of confusion prevailing in technical assessments. And within the last decades, he says, of course, the Ferry FD2 team gave an excellent insider presentation of Royal Aeronautical Society, and how the world speed record was broken on a very tight budget.
Yes.
So his emphasis here is it's an illustration of he who doesn't study history makes mistakes and is doomed to repeat them. And so is it that technical assessment, that ability to actually look at what is realistic, which you've touched on a number of times? What was missing in the RAF to allow that realism to prevail?
Well, technical assessment was certainly possible, and independent bodies such as the Royal Aircraft Establishment existed specifically for that purpose. But whether their conclusions were actually listened to, I think depended largely on whether they met either industry's demands for further work and the RAF's preference for something that was leading edge, which all too often turned out to be bleeding edge. I can only go back to this notion that the RAF has long had this desire to somehow show it has a degree of parity with the United States Air Force, rather than accepting that it inevitably is going to be at least several rungs down the ladder. And if it actually had a more realistic approach, it would, I think, have had better aircraft more readily and probably at lower cost than was actually the case. For things like the Ferry Delta II, yes, enormous potential, but it didn't fit in with the prevailing notion at the time that interceptors were on the way out, that Lightning would be the last manned interceptor. If you were going to have a last manned interceptor, you may as well have made it the FD2, not the Lightning. I'm not a Lightning fan. Sorry for anyone here who is.
No, I don't like the Lightning at all. No, there's no words allowed to you if you're a Lightning fan.
Oh, absolutely. Some people get terribly upset if you.
Okay, so I think we're gonna call it, because I want to get to the pub. It's the whole reason we started early. You're very welcome to join us. It's the Hog's Head, which we're going to. For those online, you're welcome to drink your own beer. But yes, please do come with us. It's an absolute delight to have had you here, Paul. We actually had you as the last speaker before we went into the COVID lockdown. So hoping that history doesn't repeat itself, and we aren't struck by a different global pandemic this time. But for all of you here in Wolverhampton, thank you very much for coming. For all of you who've tuned in online, thank you for watching. And thank you very much.
Thank you.